Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching. Hengler braced himself against a flickering console as Caliban 7's planetary grid screamed in protest. The overhead lights stuttered. Alarms howled. Every readout on his station was a mess of static and error messages, warning him about things he could already see with his own eyes. He had spent years preparing for disasters. Earthquakes, reactor failures, colony-wide depressurization. Every worst-case scenario had a checklist, a system, a way to fix things. But not this. Not the sky splitting open. Not the fire raining down. Not war. Out beyond the reinforced windows of the colony's central operations hub, the skyline was disappearing. The high-rise industrial sector was on fire, reduced to half-melted skeletons of steel and burning composites. Smoke curled through the streets, weaving between buildings like something alive, swallowing the city whole. Someone groaned nearby. Hengler turned and saw Corporal William DiCenzo leaning against a collapsed bulkhead, his uniform blackened with soot, his forehead slick with blood. One of his gauntlets was half-melted from a heat blast. The man shouldn't even be standing. "Tell me we're sending a distress signal," DiCenzo said, voice raw. "I'm trying," Hengler muttered. "They hit the main array." "Backup relays?" Hengler didn't answer right away. The error codes on his screen already told him everything he needed to know. They're jammed. Every frequency. DiCenzo let out a short, bitter laugh, sliding down the bulkhead. "So that's it, huh? No cavalry." Hengler clenched his fists, staring at the displays. "We're not dead yet." The first wave had been orbital bombardments, not to flatten the colony, just to rip out its teeth. Defense platforms, automated turrets, anything that could fire back. The second wave had come in the form of ships, not sleek war machines, not polished fleets. The Zarek didn't have that kind of technology. Their vessels were jagged, modular things, cobbled together from whatever they could salvage or steal. They shifted mid-flight, their plating rearranging like shifting puzzle pieces, forming attack formations as they swarmed toward the surface. They weren't built for long wars. They were built to win fast. And then, the third wave, the drop pods. Thousands of them. They punched through the atmosphere like iron meteors, slamming into city streets, industrial yards, rooftops. The ground quaked with each impact. Their hydraulic stabilizers hissed, and then hatches blew outward, releasing the invaders. Below, the streets were in chaos. Civilians ran in all directions, some clutching children, others dragging wounded neighbors through the wreckage. A transport skidded sideways on the main thoroughfare, slamming into a market stall as its pilot, blinded by the smoke, fought for control. A woman screamed for someone who would never answer. Fires consumed entire blocks, and through the deafening wail of alarms, the distant sound of gunfire signaled that the invasion had reached the ground. The Zarek weren't giants. They weren't the towering monstrosities from human nightmare fuel holovids. But their armor made them look that way. Patchwork plating, dull gray composites streaked with oxidized copper, bulked them up, amplified their strength. Servo motors hissed with every step. And they moved like a force that had rehearsed this invasion 1,000 times before. Hengler had seen them firsthand. The first squads had spread out with tactical precision, sweeping the streets, setting up kill boxes, shutting down escape routes before most of the colony even realized what was happening. And then the real fight had started. The colony's pilots had launched in whatever they could fly, civilian freighters, outdated patrol ships, even cargo haulers with mounted turrets. Some of them hadn't even made it past the stratosphere before getting ripped apart. But some did. A trio of veteran pilots, flying through orbital debris, used it as cover and launched a surprise counterattack. They took down 2 Zarek vessels before the invaders caught on and countered. It hadn't been a victory, but it had been a moment. On the ground, the civilians didn't just run. A dock worker used a stolen pulse cutter to carve through an enemy mech's leg. A security officer fired a single round and dropped a Zarek before getting shredded by plasma fire. A group of engineers jury-rigged industrial welders into makeshift flamethrowers, forcing invaders to retreat from a loading bay. They weren't trained soldiers. They weren't an army. But they weren't going to die without a fight. The Zarek had come expecting a slaughter. But they got a war. And they wouldn't forget. Across the city amidst the wreckage, Colonel Martin Hill came back to the world in pieces, half convinced he was already dead. The last thing he remembered was the ceiling collapsing as a shockwave blasted through the defense barracks. Now the thick taste of dust and blood filled his mouth, and a high-pitched ringing clawed at his ears. He forced himself upright, blinking through the haze. He wasn't dead, but plenty of his men were. The once pristine staging ground for the colony's security forces was now a smoking ruin, half buried under the weight of its own reinforced plating. Fires licked at the walls. The comm station was a molten husk. Shattered helmets, broken rifles, and the bodies of men he'd trained with for years littered the floor. Hill ground his teeth, scanning for survivors. "Anyone still breathing?" His voice came out hoarse but firm. A groan answered from nearby. Lieutenant Rhodes, face smeared with soot, pushed himself up from under a collapsed locker. Further down, a pair of corporals staggered to their feet, one clutching his side, the other gripping the remains of a rifle like a lifeline. 4 men. That was all that was left of his command post. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. Rhodes coughed, trying to steady himself. "Perimeter's gone. Main force wiped out before they could even mobilize. I tried." Hill cut him off. "You tried, and you're still alive. That means you try again." The lieutenant nodded, fists clenched. There was no room for doubt. Not now. Outside, the battle was already lost. Hill could hear the plasma fire growing closer, the rhythmic pounding of Zarek boots sweeping through the ruins. They weren't patrolling. They were clearing the wreckage, executing the wounded. They had minutes at best. Hill looked around the shattered barracks, then at the old access panel near the storage bay. The underground maintenance tunnels ran deep beneath the colony, deep enough to move unseen. He pointed. "We go down. Now." The corporals hesitated. "Sir, if we abandon the barracks—" "This isn't a barracks anymore," Hill snapped. "It's a graveyard. You want to die here, fine, but I'm not going to hand them another easy kill." No one argued after that. One by one they moved, cautious, wounded, but determined. The Zarek wouldn't find bodies here. Not yet. Elsewhere in the colony, buried in failing systems and broken signals, Hengeler knew they were losing. The smoke-choked skyline outside was proof enough. And he had one job left. He exhaled, forcing his hands steady as he ran another system scan. Somewhere in this damn colony, there had to be a way past the interference. "There's got to be something left," he muttered. "A repeater, a low-frequency channel. Hell, even an old maintenance uplink." DiCenzo, still slumped against the bulkhead, just shook his head. "If there was, you'd have found it by now." Hengeler ignored him, shifting to another panel, digging through every buried system in the network. 1 bar of signal. Then 2. His breath caught. A burst of static rippled across the speakers. Something was breaking through. And then the signal collapsed. Not interference, not a malfunction. His stomach churned. Someone had cut it off. DiCenzo caught the look on his face. "It's bad, isn't it?" Hengeler didn't answer right away. He just stared at the broken console, at the flashing error message, at the realization that settled like iron in his chest. He swallowed hard. "We're on our own." The acrid scent of scorched metal and burning composites filled the air as Caliban 7's skyline flickered with the glow of controlled devastation. The colony was no longer just a settlement. It was occupied territory. Zarek patrols moved efficiently, securing intersections, checking bodies, and sweeping buildings for survivors. Their segmented armor clanked with every step, formations shifting in perfect synchronization. They carried themselves like conquerors, but they weren't. Not yet. The humans had fought. harder than the Zarek expected. The wreckage of downed ships still smoldered on the outskirts of the city, where desperate pilots had taken the fight into the sky, managing to cripple enemy vessels before being torn apart. In the industrial sector, the husks of Zarek mechs lay sprawled between collapsed buildings, proof that resistance hadn't been instant submission. Some of the colony's security forces had held their ground until they were overwhelmed, their bodies piled at makeshift barricades. And in the lower districts, beyond the reach of the occupation's rigid formations, something else was brewing. The Zarek didn't realize it yet, but they hadn't won. In the ruins of a shipping terminal, Sela Toguchi moved fast, keeping low. The air was thick with dust and the stench of burning plastics. She knew these streets better than anyone, every alley, every hidden corridor between storage yards. Her boots barely made a sound as she darted through a broken fence, slipping behind an overturned transport. A squad of Zarek passed nearby, scanning the area. They moved in a tight formation, disciplined, cautious. Their weapons hummed faintly, charged and ready. One of them paused near the fence, helmet shifting slightly as if listening. Sela didn't breathe. Her fingers curled around the metal bar she'd pried loose from a wreck, feeling its weight, its balance. It wasn't much, but she wasn't out to win a fight, just to survive the next 10 seconds. The Zarek hesitated, then moved on. She counted 3 breaths before shifting her position. She had work to do. The colony's underground tunnels ran deep, connecting warehouses, factories, and distribution centers. Places that weren't in the official maps, places she knew like the back of her hand. And if there were still people left alive, they were going to need ways to move unseen. Across the city, near the ruined defense barracks, Johnny Cove pressed his back against a wall, holding his breath. The alley reeked of spent plasma rounds and blood. He could hear Zarek voices nearby, the sharp clicks of their language cutting through the otherwise dead streets. He adjusted his grip on the sidearm he'd pried from a dead soldier. 1 magazine. That was it. The Marine in him calculated the angles, the numbers. 3 hostiles, 1 direct line of sight. Suicide. But then, just beyond them, movement. A man, no, a kid, maybe 18, stumbled from a side street, hands half raised, shaking with fear. A survivor who had been stupid enough to move in the open. One of the Zarek turned, raised his rifle. Cove moved. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and deafening. The first Zarek dropped instantly, the shot punching through the gap in his armor at the neck. Cove was already moving before the body hit the ground. The other 2 spun, weapons shifting. Cove didn't stop. His shoulder slammed into the second, knocking the Zarek's rifle off target. A plasma shot seared past his ear, so close he felt the heat. He fired again, point blank. The third raised his rifle. A blur of movement. The kid had a knife. Didn't hesitate. Drove it between the Zarek's armor plates, a wild, desperate attack that sent them both tumbling. Cove didn't wait to see the outcome. He ripped the rifle from the second body, then ended the fight with a single shot. Silence. The kid panted, eyes wide, knife still embedded in the alien's chest. His hands were shaking. Cove grabbed his shoulder. "You breathing?" A nod. "Good. You're with me now." The kid swallowed hard. "Where are we going?" Cove pulled an extra magazine from the fallen Zarek's belt and slammed it into place. "To find more people who aren't dead yet." Before he could move, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. Cove snapped his rifle up, then lowered it. Sela Toguchi stepped into view, gripping a length of pipe, her eyes scanning him. The kid, the bodies on the ground. There was no hesitation, no wasted words. She nodded once. Cove returned it. Whatever fight she had been through, she had already made her choice. Without another word, she fell in step beside him. In the Nexus, the Zarek had taken full control. Their leader, Chancellor Vorash, stood before his officers, watching the colony's security feeds flicker on the central display. The occupation was proceeding as planned. Humans were being corralled into containment sites. Military forces had been neutralized. The colony was secured, or so it seemed. "This day will be remembered," Vorash said, voice measured, authoritative. "Not just by us, but by all who doubted the Tsarek dominion. We were dismissed as scavengers, as remnants of an age that would fade. But here, today, we stand as rulers of this world." His officers stood in silent approval. Vorash turned to one of the command staff. "Status of the humans? Containment sectors hold approximately 3,000. Civilian populations are subdued. Resistance is minimal." "Minimal." Vorash echoed the word. "And the interference?" Vorash asked, his gaze shifting to another officer. The Tsarek's comm specialist straightened. "Still active. The stellar anomalies in this system are disrupting long-range transmissions, and most of the short ones too, just as predicted. However, we do not know how long the effect will last." Vorash exhaled, his mandibles clicking in thought. "Then we must move quickly. The humans will not stay disorganized forever. We need them broken, but alive. They are more valuable as leverage than as corpses." A moment passed. Then he gestured to the sector map, where parts of the city flickered with irregular activity. "There," he pointed, "and there. Uncoordinated, but persistent." The officer hesitated. "A few scattered holdouts. They are insignificant." Vorash's eyes lingered on the displays. Insignificant forces do not survive long against an overwhelming army. He let the weight of his words settle, then turned to the officer, mandibles twitching in a way that might have been sarcasm. "So tell me, why are they still alive?" Nobody dared to answer. Beneath the city, in the dark tunnels of the utility sector, Jacob Hengeler hunched over a damaged console, working fast. Corporal William DiCenzo stood nearby, keeping his rifle steady, his posture tense. The only light came from the flickering console and the dim emergency strips running along the tunnel walls. Hengeler had spent hours searching for something, anything, that could change their situation, but every scan told the same story. They were cut off, isolated, and alone. The colony's entire communication grid was compromised. He could see the gaps, small pockets where a signal might slip through, but every attempt to force a transmission ended in failure. DiCenzo shifted, glancing toward the tunnel entrance. "How much longer?" Hengeler exhaled through his nose. "I don't know. Maybe never." A sound echoed through the tunnel. Boots on metal. DiCenzo snapped his rifle up, and Hengeler reached for his sidearm, pulse hammering. A low voice cut through the dark. "Hold your fire." A shadow moved beyond the dim emergency lights. Then, Colonel Martin Hill stepped into view, rifle raised, but not aimed. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with ash, but his stance was firm. 4 soldiers followed close behind, weapons ready. For a second, no one moved. Then recognition settled in. Hengeler lowered his gun, tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "Colonel," Hill nodded once. "Engineer." His eyes flicked to the console. "You trying to reach someone?" "If I can find a gap in the interference," Hengeler muttered. "They cut us off, but there's still something. Just need to find the right window." Hill glanced at the screen, then at Hengeler. "Good. Because we need every advantage we can get." The 4 soldiers behind Hill moved cautiously into position. DiCenzo exchanged a glance with Hengeler but said nothing. For the first time since the invasion began, the room didn't feel quite as empty. The 2 men locked eyes. Above them, the city was occupied. Beneath them, the war was about to begin. Hengeler wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, the glow of the console reflecting off his narrowed eyes. The signal was there, buried, weak, but not gone. The Tsarek hadn't jammed everything. They had cut the primary relays, but something in the backup system was still whispering through the noise. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Hill crouched beside him, scanning the console with a keen eye. "Can you use it?" "Maybe," Hengeler muttered. "Not for long-distance comms, but I might be able to patch something through. Short range, low frequency, direct transmission only. Nothing clean, Nothing stable. Hill smirked. That means we can coordinate. A grim satisfaction flickered between them. Hengler kept working. Hill turned to his men. We can't sit in the dark any longer. If the Zarek think they have control, we let them believe it, and then we start cutting them apart. The soldiers nodded. They didn't need orders to fight back. They needed direction. We move in 2 teams. DiCenzo, you and Hengler stay down here. One of the soldiers will stay here with you. Find a way to get messages through. If we can link up with survivors, we turn this mess into a war. DiCenzo grunted. Understood. Hill's gaze shifted to the other 3 soldiers. We're heading topside. We need supplies, weapons, and eyes on enemy movements. He slung his rifle over his shoulder. If the bastards want to hold this city, we make them pay for every damn street. With that, Hill turned, motioning for his men to move. As they disappeared into the darkness, Hengler exhaled sharply and got back to work. Above them, on the streets, Kove and Toguchi moved through the ruins like ghosts. The city above belonged to the Zarek, but the streets below, the wreckage, the forgotten corners, the places only workers and engineers ever cared about, belonged to them. Kove had seen occupations before. The first few hours were always the same. Checkpoints went up, supplies got seized, people started disappearing, and then the occupiers got comfortable. That's when they started bleeding. Toguchi pressed her back against a supply truck, eyes scanning the alley ahead. Processing facility up ahead, she murmured. Kove checked his weapon. He had 3 magazines. It would have to be enough. They holding prisoners there? He asked. Toguchi nodded. At least 50. Probably more. Kove exhaled. Good. Let's break them out. The Zarek had repurposed the colony's largest warehouse into a makeshift holding center. Its reinforced walls were perfect for containing people. The guards inside were bored. They'd executed the military survivors already. The civilians weren't a threat. They were wrong. Kove crouched behind a ventilation shaft, watching the patrol patterns. 5 guards outside, another 3 at the main doors. More inside. Toguchi knelt beside him, voice barely a whisper. Cargo access point. There's an emergency override in the main control room. Kove smirked. Can you open it? Give me 5 minutes. Take 3. She vanished into the shadows. Kove moved. The first guard didn't see him until it was too late. The blade slid between the Zarek's armor plates, the body hitting the ground with barely a sound. 2 more patrolled the next corridor. Kove waited for the right moment, then struck. A gunshot. A knife, 2 bodies down. Then, the lights flickered. The security doors slammed open. Inside, the prisoners reacted instantly. The first guard who turned his weapon on them was ripped apart by a mob of desperate hands. The second didn't even get to fire before a stolen rifle blew his skull apart. Kove stormed inside. Move! Toguchi's voice crackled in his earpiece. You've got 30 seconds before reinforcements arrive. Kove grabbed a rifle off a fallen Zarek and tossed it to one of the prisoners. Then we'd better make them count. On another corner of the colony, Hill's men struck fast. They moved through the shattered industrial sector, hitting supply depots, setting up ambush points. They didn't fight fair. They fought smart. A Zarek patrol was pinned in an alley when a rigged fuel line ignited, turning the street into an inferno. Another squad was cut off when their transport was disabled. The second they got out, a sniper put rounds through their visors. They were getting frustrated. Hill wanted them angry. Angry enemies made mistakes. Vorash stood in the Nexus watching the latest reports. His claws curled against the metal table. He shouldn't be hearing reports of Zarek deaths. The humans were broken. The city was theirs. And yet, a containment site was breached. A patrol was wiped out. Sabotage reports were increasing. He turned sharply. Where is this resistance coming from? An officer hesitated. Scattered groups. We underestimated the number of survivors. Vorash's eyes twitched. No, We underestimated their will to fight." He growled lowly. "This is not an insurgency. Yet." He turned back to the display, watching the red blips marking casualties. But it could become one. Night still clung to the ruins of Caliban 7 when the first explosion shattered the silence. Fire bloomed in the industrial district, sending shockwaves through the empty streets as a Zarek fuel depot erupted into flame. In the darkness, Colonel Hill and his soldiers moved swiftly, slipping between wreckage and abandoned vehicles. They struck fast, sabotaging supply caches, rigging transport lines to detonate, forcing the invaders onto the defensive before dawn. By the time the second wave of detonations rippled across the colony, Hill had already pulled his team back toward the tunnels. They had done their damage. Now, it was time to regroup. The second day of the occupation began with smoke. Thick black columns spiraled into the sky, rising from fuel depots, transport hubs, and storage facilities that had once belonged to the colony. Now, they belonged to no one. Explosions echoed through the ruins of Caliban 7 as the resistance struck at the Zarek's supply chains, cutting into the backbone of their logistics. Kova watched from a crumbling rooftop as one of the invaders' forward bases detonated in a violent burst of flame, sending debris flying across the streets below. A distant, distorted scream. Zarek. Good. Behind him, a handful of survivors crouched in the shadows, watching as their sabotage took effect. Former captives, workers, and scavengers who had chosen to fight rather than hide. Some held stolen weapons, others gripped makeshift clubs and blades. They weren't an army, but they were more than just two people in the dark. Kove adjusted his rifle and glanced at Toguchi, crouched by his side, eyes scanning the burning streets. "They're scrambling," she muttered. Kove smirked. "They always do." Beneath them, Zarek squads mobilized in disarray. The alien warriors, once so methodical in their approach, now moved frantically, their lines breaking apart as they struggled to contain the growing chaos. Supply lines were severed. Their transport vehicles, hulking six-legged machines with retractable cargo compartments, were being hijacked or blown apart. Patrol routes were choked with debris, forcing them into unpredictable patterns. They had prepared for a battle. They hadn't prepared for a war of attrition. Vorash stood rigid in the nexus, mandibles tight as he listened to the latest reports. Disruptions, losses, setbacks. The humans were proving to be an infestation rather than prey. He turned toward his officers, his piercing eyes narrowing. "How many supply caches have been lost?" A lieutenant hesitated. 3 confirmed, 2 more compromised. "Fuel reserves, down to 60% capacity. If this continues..." Vorash's gaze snapped to him. A second of silence, just long enough to be a threat. The officer stiffened. "We will adapt," Vorash growled, turning back to the holographic city map. Red markers blinked where supply routes had been disrupted. Infections spreading. "This isn't random," he murmured. The humans weren't just fighting back. They're planning something bigger. Deep in the tunnels beneath the colony, Hengeler jogged behind a squad of armed soldiers, his breath steady, but his mind racing. The underground conduits ran through the bones of Caliban 7, stretching beneath the industrial zones, linking supply hubs and service stations. It was the circulatory system of the city, and right now, it was the only thing keeping them hidden. But it wasn't enough. They needed to communicate. He had an idea, a dangerous one. "Colonel," Hengeler called, pulling up beside Hill as they moved through the dim tunnels. "I think I know why the comms are down." Hill gave him a sharp glance. "Explain." "It's not just jamming. It's something else." Hengeler frowned at his scanner, watching the chaotic waveforms pulse across the screen. Hill narrowed his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Hengeler exhaled. "There's a pattern here. There are gaps, small bursts of open frequency." Hill processed that in seconds. "You think we can piggyback on those gaps?" "It's irregular, but I think we can work with it," Hengeler said. If I reroute transmissions through secondary relays and narrow the bandwidth, we might be able to push short-range comms further than before. It won't be perfect, but it's better than nothing." Hill stopped. He turned to his men. "We're changing course. We're heading up." One of the soldiers, Sergeant Kellerman, frowned. "Sir, if we break cover now, we get shot, we die," Hill finished. "But if we don't figure out how to communicate, we lose anyway." He looked at Hengler. "What do you need?" Hengler masked the back of his neck. "A transmitter, and a building tall enough to catch the gap." The old broadcasting tower was half collapsed, a skeletal remnant of metal beams and shattered panels, but it still stood. Hengler and Hill crouched behind cover near its base as gunfire tore through the ruined street, plasma bursts melting through rubble. "We need to move now," Hengler barked. Hill didn't hesitate. "Covering fire! Move!" The soldiers unleashed hell, their rifles flashing as they laid down suppressive fire. Hengler ran. He climbed. Metal creaked beneath him, loose debris crumbling away, but he didn't stop. Every movement burned, every breath came ragged, but he reached the top. And there it was, the gap. His fingers flew over the console. The old transmitter flickered, sparked, then finally caught. He activated the signal. "This is Hengler. Any human forces receiving this, respond." A second passed. 2. Then, a few miles Aya, Kova felt the shift before he saw it. The Zarek were changing tactics. He and Toguchi had spent the last few hours using every advantage the city gave them, setting traps, cutting power, leading patrols into dead ends where explosives waited. The invaders had struggled to adapt at first, their rigid formations breaking down as they tried to react. But now, Kove crouched against a wall, watching a group of Zarek as they advanced through the streets. Their movements were tighter, smarter. They weren't just searching, they were herding. "They're shifting tactics," Toguchi whispered. Kove nodded, watching as their patrols moved with more intent. They weren't perfect yet. Still gaps in their coordination, still moments of hesitation, but they were learning. Then, his radio crackled. At first, just static. Then, a pulse, a shift in the noise. And finally, a voice. "There's somebody listening? This is Cove. Who the hell is this?" Hengler nearly collapsed in relief. "Resistance. We're alive down here." A pause. Then Cove's voice came back, sharp and certain. "Not just down there. We've been fighting topside." Hill's voice cut through the comms. "Then it's time to fight together." The connection was weak, but it was enough. Cove kept his eyes on the dimly lit corridor, weapon ready, while the voices crackled through the makeshift comm line. Hill, Hengler, survivors beneath the colony. He could hear the weight in their voices, the same weight that had been pressing on his own shoulders for the last 2 days. "This changes things," Hill's voice came through, steady but sharp. Cove exhaled. "Yeah, it does." Toguchi knelt beside him, adjusting the comm relay they'd stolen from a Zarek patrol. It barely worked, but it was still functioning. She looked up, eyes scanning the darkened detention center where survivors were still securing weapons from their fallen captors. "First time we're not just reacting," she muttered. Cove tapped his earpiece. "Hill, we need to hit them harder. If we don't, they'll regroup and lock this place down tighter than before." A brief silence. Then, Hill's response. "We already have a plan. We're working out the details now." The underground safe house smelled of fuel, sweat, and scorched metal. The stolen comm unit flickered weakly, casting dim light on Hengler's strained expression as he adjusted the frequency. Hill stood beside him, rifle strapped across his chest, waiting. "We need to move," Hengler said. "The longer we stay cut off, the worse this gets. I think I know how to handle this, but we need to get to the communication station if we want to break through this interference." Hill nodded. "Then we get you there. But that's across open ground. We won't make it without them seeing us coming." A pause. Then Cove's voice crackled through the comms. Then we hit them first, hard. Hengler adjusted his glasses. Unless we had something to draw their attention away. Kove caught on. A ship. But where can we find a ship? Hill nodded grimly. We have one. An old one. But we'll serve. That caught Hengler's attention. Hill continued. There's a hangar near the outer district. Zarek haven't touched it yet. I spotted a colony transport there when we were moving supplies. If we can launch it, they'll think we're trying to escape. Hengler frowned. I can reprogram it, but they'll shoot it down fast. It doesn't need to last long, Hill said. Just long enough for us to move. Kove's voice came through again. Then while they're chasing ghosts, we take Sector 3. They're still holding people there. Hill nodded. We hit them from two sides. Hengler and I take the hangar, reprogram the transport, then push for the station. Kove, you take the civilians and hit the detention center. Hengler glanced at Hill. And how do we get from the hangar to the station without getting lit up? Before Hill could answer, Taguchi's voice crackled through the comms. I know how. There was a pause. Then Hill adjusted his earpiece. All right, Taguchi, talk to me. Her voice came steady. There's an underground loading tunnel connecting them. Used to be for supply transfers before we switched to drone haulers. Most people don't know about it. Hengler frowned. And you do? A slight chuckle came through the line. Some of us actually paid attention during colony orientation. Hill exhaled. All right, we have our way in. Kove's voice came back through the comms. We move fast. The moment that ship explodes, we hit them hard. Hill nodded. We do this fast. We do this clean. They moved. Through shattered streets, past burning wreckage, staying low, staying unseen. Every shadow could be a threat, every turn a potential death trap. But they kept moving, because stopping meant dying. Then, the hangar came into view. It was a graveyard. Scorched plating, shattered machinery, broken hulls from the first wave of the invasion. Hengler crouched beside the transport's interface, rewriting its launch protocols line by line. His fingers moved fast, sweat forming on his brow. It has to work, he thought. Hill stood by the entrance with Kellerman and the other soldiers, rifles trained on the doors. They didn't expect visitors, but they weren't taking chances. Engine ignition in 30 seconds, Hengler said. Hill nodded. Fall back to position. The transport whined to life, engines sputtering, shaking the dust from the hangar's ruined walls. Then it launched. It wasn't fast. It wasn't meant to be. It wobbled, barely stabilizing, climbing toward the smoke-filled sky like a wounded beast. And the Zarek saw it. Sir, human vessel has launched from the surface. Vorash turned sharply toward the command officer. The holographic display flickered. A colony transport was breaching low orbit. Impossible. They had no ships left. Destroy it, he growled, furious. The transport climbed higher, just high enough. And then, it exploded. A chain of detonations tore through the air as the ship ripped itself apart. The debris scattered, falling back toward the city, lighting the sky in a storm of wreckage. Zarek fighters circled, adjusting their formation, waiting for more ships to launch. There wouldn't be any. Hill smirked. They had bought time. Move, he ordered, already leading his men toward the communication station. Sector 3 was a war zone. The detention site loomed ahead, a reinforced structure of metal and stone, its entrances guarded by squads of Zarek soldiers. They weren't expecting an assault. Kove moved first. 2 quick shots. One Zarek fell. The other spun toward them, weapon rising. Taguchi fired. The shot went wide, sparking off a metal beam before ricocheting straight into the alien's throat. He crumpled. Taguchi exhaled sharply, gripping the gun tighter. She hadn't meant to hit that, but she wasn't about to complain. The resistance surged forward. A blast tore through the sidewall, rigged explosives from their scavenged stockpile. The humans poured inside, a flood of desperate survivors turning into an unstoppable force. Guards shouted, scrambling to hold position, but it was too late. Taguchi sprinted toward the security panel, bypassing the lock. "We're in!" The doors slid open. The prisoners hesitated. Then all hell broke loose. They lunged for weapons, for their captors, beating them down with the fury of 2 days in chains. Cove barely had time to call out before the last of the guards broke ranks, trying to flee. One of them stumbled. A metal beam, swung by a prisoner, crashed against the side of his helmet. Armor plates cracked, bent inward. The Tsarek staggered, claws scraping the ground. Cove raised his weapon, but stopped. The alien wasn't getting back up. For the first time, Cove really saw it. Beneath the fractured armor, the Tsarek's body was thin, sinewy. Not the towering force they pretended to be. The armor was their strength. Without it, they were breakable. Taguchi saw it too. They're not as strong as we thought. Cove exhaled. No. He looked back at the freed prisoners, at the weapons they held, at the enemy that wasn't invincible anymore. They're not. Vorash stood motionless as the reports came in. A detention center had fallen. A communications station was compromised, and the ship, it had been a lie. His claws curled against the metal table. This was impossible. A war fleet had seized this world. They had crushed resistance, broken defenses. And yet, these humans refused to die. They weren't retreating. They weren't breaking. They were hunting. His grip tightened, metal groaning under his strength. His mind raced. How? How had they let this happen? His officers stood silent, waiting. Vorash bared his teeth. No more mistakes. He turned sharply. Deploy the purge squads. The air inside the communications station was thick with dust and static. The facility had been abandoned since the first wave of the invasion, left to decay under the weight of broken systems and collapsed infrastructure. But the core remained intact. Hengeler crouched near the main console, working fast the interface, sweat trickling down his forehead. They didn't have time. Hill and his soldiers secured the room, rifles raised toward the door, waiting for the inevitable. The Tsarek would come. Talk to me, Hill muttered. Hengeler's eyes flickered across the screen, analyzing the interference, tracing the source of the disruption. Something wasn't right. The interference isn't just jamming, he muttered, voice tight with concentration. It's an electromagnetic pulse cycling through the atmosphere. He frowned. Oh, hell. Hill turned sharply. What? Hengeler swallowed hard. It's not just interference, it's the damn star. Hill narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Hengeler adjusted his glasses, pushing deeper into the system logs. The Tsarek aren't just blocking us. They've been amplifying something that was already here. He tapped a sequence, pulling up raw waveforms. The stellar activity. They knew it would happen. They planned for it. Hill's expression darkened. You're telling me they saw this coming? They didn't just see it coming, Hengeler hissed. They built their invasion around it. They're using orbital relays to feed the star's interference right back into our systems, turning our own technology against us. Hill clenched his jaw. Can you break it? Hengeler's mind raced. Now that I know what to look for? Maybe. The gaps in the interference. They're real, but unstable. His breath hitched. I can force a signal through. It won't last, but it'll be enough. Hill nodded once. Do it. Hengeler entered the final override. The system shuddered, screens blinking. The emergency relay, a backup meant for colony-wide disaster scenarios, activated. Then, a connection. He didn't hesitate. This is Jacob Hengeler of Caliban 7. Human colony under attack. Tsarek occupation. Hostile forces overwhelming resistance. If anyone can hear this... Static. Then, a pulse. The signal pushed through. Repeat. Caliban 7 under siege. Send immediate reinforcements. The transmission locked. The emergency beacon flared red. It was out. For a moment, Hengeler let himself breathe. And then, the first explosion hit. Tsarek forces breached the outer walls in seconds. The impact of plasma detonations sent shockwaves through the facility. Hill barely had time to bark a warning before the main corridor erupted in gunfire. Contact! DiCenzo shouted, opening fire. The first wave of Tzarek stormed through the blast doors, their armor catching the dim red glow of emergency lights. Their weapons hummed, plasma bolts ripping through debris. Hill fired first. One shot to the visor, a direct hit. The alien staggered, crumpling backward. Another lunged toward them. DiCenzo's rifle barked, cutting him down. The fight collapsed into chaos. Hengeler ducked behind a console, hands gripping the edges of the terminal. They had sent the message. That was all that mattered. Hill's voice cut through the noise. "We're pulling out. Now!" They fell back, moving through the ruined corridors, gunfire echoing behind them. The station was lost. But the signal was out. And that meant hope, however faint, was still alive. Kove crouched behind an overturned vehicle, watching the street burn. The Tzarek were everywhere. They had shifted tactics. No more strategic sweeps, no more controlled advances. Now, it was pure carnage. Taguchi slid beside him, her breathing steady despite the chaos. "They're throwing everything at us," she muttered. Kove checked his rifle. "Yeah." He glanced toward the civilians huddled behind makeshift barricades, former prisoners, workers, refugees who had become soldiers overnight. Some clutched scavenged weapons, others held nothing but metal pipes and sheer determination. They had no time to wait. Kove tapped his earpiece. "Hengeler, talk to me." The response came between breaths. "Message is out." Kove let out a slow breath. Reinforcements would come. But until then, they had to survive. His gaze shifted toward the Tzarek shock troops advancing down the boulevard. He could see their armor, intact, reinforced. That had to change. He turned to Taguchi. "We need to hit them up close." She frowned. "You want to rush them?" Kove shook his head. "I want to strip them." The signal was given. Then the trap was sprung. The first explosion sent the Tzarek scrambling. Kove's group moved through the dust and fire, using the distraction to close the gap. A soldier swung a metal beam, smashing against a Tzarek's helmet. The alien staggered, and Kove was there, ripping at the cracked armor, exposing the sinewy flesh beneath. The alien reeled back, weaker, unbalanced. Taguchi fired. The shot tore through the unarmored torso. The Tzarek collapsed, and that was it. Kove's eyes burned with realization. They weren't invincible. He turned, grabbing the nearest fighter, a former dock worker, still gripping a steel rod in shaking hands. "Aim for the armor! Break it! Tear it off!" The civilians didn't hesitate. A wave of desperate fury crashed against the invaders. Tzarek warriors, once towering and unstoppable, fell under the sheer force of human ingenuity and rage. The streets became a war zone. Vorash paced in the nexus, his claws tapping against metal. The battle reports came too fast. Losses, resistance, entire sectors falling into disarray. The occupation was crumbling. His chest tightened with a mix of fury and disbelief. This was impossible. An officer hesitated before speaking. "Leader Vorash, we intercepted a transmission from the human communication station." Vorash stopped. His eyes narrowed. "What transmission?" The screen flickered, then static. Fragments of the distress call, partially corrupted by interference, echoed through the nexus. "Repeat. Caliban 7 under siege. Send immediate reinforcements." Silence filled the room. Metal groaned under his claws as Vorash clenched his fists. They had done it. Somehow, with limited resources and no real chance of success, the humans had sent a distress call. His heartbeat quickened. This didn't make sense. They were crushed, surrounded. How were they still doing this? His gaze swept over his officers. None dared to speak. For the first time, he felt it, a sliver of fear creeping beneath his skin. This couldn't happen. "Prepare all troops." His voice was low, cold. An officer hesitated. "Leader, our resources are—" Vorash turned, his eyes burning with fury. "I said all of them." The officer swallowed hard and nodded. Vorash turned back to the colony's hologram, watching the human resistance points flicker like a virus refusing to be erased. "If they want to fight to the end," he growled, "then we will give them the end." Smoke and the acrid scent of scorched metal choked the city. The war had reached its peak. Fires raged in the industrial sector, columns of black smoke twisting into the sky like funeral pyres. The streets, once littered with the shattered remains of resistance, now bore the scars of a battle shifting against the invaders. Hill pressed his back against the remnants of a collapsed barricade, his rifle gripped tight. Plasma fire streaked across the avenue, the bursts reflecting off the cracked visors of his men. Beside him, Hengler crouched low over a portable interface, hands darting across the screen as he rerouted power grids and mapped enemy positions. "They're coming in heavier than before," Hill muttered, watching as another Zarek squad pushed forward, their armor reflecting the firelit streets. "They know they're losing control," Hengler replied, not looking up. Across the city, Cove and Taguchi led their ragtag force of armed civilians through a winding network of alleyways. They moved with purpose now, not as prey avoiding their hunters, but as wolves closing in on a wounded predator. The resistance had adapted quickly. They weren't just firing anymore. They were targeting weak points, striking joints, severing power sources, forcing the Zarek to fight without the armored suits that made them powerful. The moment one of the invaders lost their plating, the battle shifted. Taguchi whispered into her comms, "They're funneling forces toward the reprocessing plant. If they get there, they'll have direct access to the water reserves." Cove swore under his breath. "They're trying to make sure we don't win even if we kill them." "They want to burn the whole damn place down," she agreed. "We have to stop them." Cove slipped behind the wreckage as a Zarek squad moved past, their formations tightening in the open street. He watched as two of them peeled away, clearing debris near a breached supply station. He signaled Taguchi and the others. They moved in quick and silent. The first Zarek didn't see the attack coming. A civilian wielding a heavy wrench slammed it against the armor's exposed servos, sending sparks flying. A second strike severed the connection, forcing the armor to lock. The alien let out a sharp, guttural noise, panic setting in as he struggled against his own suit. Cove ended it with a single shot. Taguchi took the second target. A small explosive, barely more than a repurposed mining charge, was shoved into the back vents of the armor before it detonated, sending the alien sprawling. His unarmored limbs twitched weakly, then went still. Hill's comm crackled to life. "They're targeting the reprocessing plant," Cove's voice came through. "If they take it out, the colony won't be livable, win or lose." Hill's fists clenched. "Understood. We'll cut them off." He turned to Hengler. "We need a way into that plant before they do." He nodded, his eyes scanning the structural layouts. "There's an access corridor beneath the main refinery. Utility tunnels run straight to the plant." "Will the doors open for us?" Hill asked. Hengler let out a breath. "Not without some persuasion." Hill nodded. "Get it done." The Zarek forces pressed forward, their numbers still overwhelming. Vorash had abandoned strategy. This was now sheer endurance. If they couldn't hold Caliban 7, they would make sure no one else could. His mandibles clicked in irritation as more reports flooded in. The impossible had happened. The humans had forced an occupying force into retreat. This was not how it was supposed to go. His claws curled against the metal railing of the Nexus, his officers watching him, waiting for orders. "Deploy everything," Vorash growled. "Every last soldier, every last resource. No retreat, no surrender." The officer hesitated. "But leader, that would mean—" "I know what it means," Vorash roared. "I will not return to our world with failure." Silence fell over the Nexus. The order was clear. This was the endgame. At the reprocessing plant, the first wave of Zarek forces arrived, moving with brutal efficiency. They weren't securing the area. They were rigging it for destruction. The resistance struck before they could finish. Hill's team emerged from the tunnels in a coordinated assault, rifles barking in rapid succession. The Zarek, caught mid-preparation, scattered under the sudden attack. Hengler sprinted toward the control panel, ducking low as a burst of plasma fire scorched the wall beside him. He slammed his toolkit against the panel, forcing a manual override. "We need more time," he shouted. "We don't have it," Hill shot back, laying down, suppressing fire. Kove's group arrived from the opposite end of the facility, catching the remaining Zarek in a brutal pincer. Civilians, scavenged weapons in hand, tore into the invaders. Toguchi moved swiftly, flanking the demolition teams and taking them down before they could activate the charges. One Zarek, his armor partially disabled, lunged at her in desperation. She twisted, using his own momentum against him, and sent him crashing against a supply crate. He scrambled up, reaching for his rifle. A wrench struck the exposed flesh of his arm, shattering bone. Toguchi stood over him, breathing hard, gripping the bloodied tool. He didn't get back up. Hengler slammed his fist against the panel. The emergency lockdown engaged, shutting down the reactor's destabilization sequence. The colony wouldn't die today. The final squads of Zarek fought viciously, but the tide had turned. They were being pushed back. Isolated pockets of resistance overwhelmed them, cutting them down, forcing them to abandon ground. Hill's rifle clicked empty. He drew his knife instead, driving it between the plates of a Zarek's armor. The alien gurgled something in his native tongue before falling limp. Across the city, the same pattern played out. The resistance wasn't just surviving anymore. They were turning the tide. Vorash watched the battle reports in stunned silence. No. They had planned for every variable, every possibility. And yet, he saw it clearly now. Their forces were broken, their strategy in ruins. His claws dug into the console. "There," he started. His voice was hoarse. He swallowed hard. "They're everywhere." He turned sharply to his officers. "We deployed everything we had, every last resource." The words tasted like bile. This wasn't just a battle. It was their species' future, decided in a single desperate act. He had promised his people that this war would elevate them, that this invasion would reshape their destiny. So they had sent everything, not just ships, not just soldiers, but the very backbone of their military might. And now, piece by piece, it was being destroyed. Vorash knew they could kill everybody and destroy the whole colony, if they had time, if they had reinforcements. But even this would not be a victory, and there were no reinforcements, because he had already sent them all. He had staked everything and lost it all. The Nexus trembled under the weight of its own failing systems. Vorash stood at the center, staring at the battlefield projections, his claws curling into the metal railing. The colony was slipping from his grasp. His mandibles twitched. His breath came sharp and unsteady. No, he would turn the tide. His officers stood frozen, their gazes darting between each other, silent in their failure. Cowards, weaklings. They had allowed this. Vorash's vision blurred with rage. He turned sharply, slamming a clawed hand against the console, his voice a guttural snarl. "Deploy the bombers. Every last one. Flatten everything. No prisoners, no survivors. Burn this world to the bedrock." The officers hesitated. His nostrils flared wide. "Now!" Scrambling hands moved over controls, issuing the command. A moment later, the feed updated. Dozens of Zarek bombers, the last remnants of their air fleet, launching from hidden staging points across the planet. Vorash growled. It wasn't enough to order it. He would lead it. He would watch this world burn from the sky. He turned to his bridge crew. "Prepare my ship for launch. I will lead this assault myself." The hesitation was brief. Commands flashed across displays, executed without question. Vorash barely noticed. His eyes remained locked on the burning colony below. He would not leave this to chance. He would see this world destroyed with his own eyes. Kove pressed his back against a shattered bulkhead, rifle gripped tight. They were losing ground. Explosions rocked the streets, fire licking at broken buildings as the Zarek assault intensified. A burning transport lay half-collapsed across the avenue, its twisted hull trapping the screams of those still inside. Smoke choked the air. Bodies, human and alien, littered the ground. His comm crackled. Toguchi. Kova. They're escalating. Another explosion. Plasma fire ripped through civilians trying to flee a collapsed structure. A woman crumpled mid-stride, clutching her gut as her lifeblood soaked through her tunic. A man trying to drag her away was cut down seconds later. Zarek pushed forward, methodical, relentless, stepping over corpses like they were nothing. Toguchi's voice came sharp. "We hold this position, or we all die." No argument. Kove snapped his rifle up, sighting a Zarek officer giving orders near an abandoned checkpoint. He exhaled, pulled the trigger. The round punched through the alien's exposed throat. The remaining squad hesitated, just long enough. Civilians, wounded, desperate, enraged, rushed the gap. A dock worker drove a makeshift spear into the visor of another Zarek. Someone else grabbed a discarded plasma rifle and fired wildly into the advancing troops. The street became a killing ground. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for vengeance. Through the industrial complex, Hill moved with deadly precision and cut down the last two Zarek, blocking their path. His rifle barked twice, one shot to the chest, the other through the skull. The aliens slumped against the rubble, blood pooling beneath them. He wiped sweat from his brow and turned to his men. "Keep pushing. We need to break them here." The resistance had tightened the noose. The Zarek were cornered, their once coordinated forces now scattered, leaderless. Hill's soldiers knew it. They could feel it. They moved with intent, cutting through the remaining invaders like predators sensing weakened prey. "Take those bastards down!" Gunfire erupted. A squad of Zarek tried to regroup near a downed transport, but the humans were faster. Hill's men flanked them, firing in unison. Two went down instantly, their armor shattered. The last turned to run, only to be cut down by a well-placed burst. The battlefield belonged to the humans now, but the sky belonged to the Zarek. Until now. The bombers streaked across the sky, their massive forms casting dark shadows over the ruined colony below. Inside the lead ship, Vorash watched the battlefield unfold from the bridge of his personal warship. His throat vibrated with a low growl as he saw his forces falling, being overrun, his empire crumbling in real time. But it didn't matter. He would have his revenge. The Zarek bombers moved into formation, their payloads primed. In moments, fire would consume everything. He allowed himself a final breath, preparing to give the order. And then the heavens opened. The first explosions came without warning. A storm of energy lanced through the clouds, ripping into the Zarek fleet with devastating precision. The lead bomber disintegrated mid-flight, its armored hull shredded like paper. The ones behind it fared no better. Missile trails streaked across the sky, tracking their targets, each detonation a death sentence. Then came the sonic booms. Human warships burst through the atmosphere, sleek and lethal, their guns already firing before the Zarek even had time to react. Vorash watched, frozen, as his bombers, his last desperate hope for victory, were torn apart in seconds. No warning, no chance, just destruction. The sky was no longer his, it was theirs. On the ground, Covey felt it first, a shift in the air, the kind of change only soldiers recognized. Then came the streaks of fire across the clouds, human drop pods descending like falling stars, impact craters marking the arrival of reinforcements. Cheers erupted across the battlefield. The resistance roared in defiance. "They're here!" Toguchi's voice was breathless. "The fleet! They came!" The remaining Zarek soldiers saw it too, and they broke. Some fought to the last, others threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. It didn't matter. The war was over. Vorash fell to his knees. The bridge around him burned, consoles flickering, alarms shrieking. But he barely heard any of it. He had failed. He had led his people to slaughter, and left his world without any protection. For nothing. He looked at his hands, claws trembling. If his kind had tears, they would drown him. "Forgive me," he whispered. Forgive me for destroying us." His officers were dead, his fleet annihilated, and outside his failing ship, the sky swarmed with human warships. Dozens of them, hundreds of them. The last remnants of the Tsarek armada flickered as sensor readings updated. More fleets arriving, endless reinforcements flooding the heavens. Caliban 7 was not just saved, it was avenged. Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Oh, and one last thing. Every great soldier knows that to survive and become a hero, taking care of yourself is key. So before you go, check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's important. And I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.